This was the cry that shattered the heavy velvet silence of Mayfair in the autumn of 1888. It was a sound so primal, so stripped of aristocratic dignity, that it sent the ravens scattering from the soot-stained rooftops of Althorpe House. Inside the master bedchamber, the air was thick with the scent of expensive French lilies and something else, something metallic and sharp that stung the nostrils. The Duchess of Althorpe, Beatrice Cavendish, a woman whose beauty was whispered about in the courts of Europe, was clawing at her own cheeks. Under the flickering glow of the gas lamps, her skin did not look like skin anymore. It was sliding away in greyish, translucent ribbons, revealing the raw, weeping red beneath. On her mahogany vanity, amidst the crystal perfume bottles, sat a small silver jar of cold cream, its lid discarded, the white ointment inside tainted by a faint, gritty, pale powder. If you are ready to uncover the darkness hidden beneath the silk of London's high society, please stay with us until the very end of this journey. This is a story of how vanity and greed can turn the most beautiful face into a mask of death. Before we dive deeper into the fog, I'd love to know, if you were pushed to the edge to save someone you loved, how far would you go? Leave a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments if this mystery grips your heart, and please subscribe to our channel to support these historical narratives. Every subscription helps us bring these forgotten shadows back to the light. In the corner of that opulent room, half hidden by the heavy velvet drapes, stood Clara. She was only 19, her maid's uniform crisp and white, but her hands were trembling so violently that the silver tray she held rattled like a death knell. She watched in frozen horror as the woman she served, the woman who had once been the toast of London, descended into a screaming delirium. Clara knew what was in that jar. She knew the secret that could send her to the gallows at Newgate Prison, and she knew that once the sun rose over the Thames, her life as she knew it would be over. Miles away from the polished cobblestones of Mayfair, the district of Smithfield told a different story. Here the air was not filled with lilies, but with the stench of the slaughterhouses and the bitter tang of coal smoke. In a small, cramped apothecary shop, wedged between a tanner and a gin palace, Dr. Silas Thorne sat hunched over a workbench. Once, Silas had been the rising star of London's medical elite, a man whose hands were trusted by earls and duchesses alike. But that was a lifetime ago, before he refused to sign a fraudulent death certificate for a powerful nobleman who had beaten a stable boy to death. Integrity had cost Silas everything: his practice, his reputation, and eventually his wife, who had died in this very room because he no longer had the influence or the funds to procure the medicine she needed. Now Silas was a ghost of a man. He spent his days grinding dried herbs for the poor, and his nights nursing a glass of cheap, stinging gin, staring at a tarnished silver medical lancet that rested in a worn velvet case. It was a relic of a life he had tried to forget. He had seen the rot beneath the silk and the lace of the upper class, and he had decided that he was done with the world of men. He wanted only the silence of his tinctures and the numbing embrace of the Smithfield fog. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with Silas Thorne. The bell above the shop door jangled, a harsh, sudden sound that cut through the low hum of the city. Silas didn't look up, his fingers busy with a mortar and pestle. The shop was closed, and he had no more mercy to give. But the person who stumbled through the door didn't ask for medicine. There was a heavy thud, the sound of a body hitting the floorboards, and then the unmistakable sweet scent of lavender mingled with something Silas recognized instantly, the cold, metallic tang of arsenic. He stood up, his old instincts flickering to life like a dying ember. On the floor lay a young woman in a maid's uniform, her face pale as parchment, her breathing shallow and ragged. It was Clara. She had run all the way from Mayfair, her shoes ruined by the filth of the streets, her eyes wide with a terror that went deeper than the fear of the law. As Silas knelt beside her, checking the pulse at her throat, she reached out and gripped his sleeve with a strength born of pure desperation. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that. They told me it would only make her kind. They told me it would save him." Silas looked at the girl, seeing not a criminal but a child caught in a web far larger than herself. He saw the stains on her apron, the residue of the same white powder that was even now eating away at the Duchess of Althorpe's face. He knew that if the police found her here, he would be implicated as well. He should turn her out. He should call the constable. But then he looked at her hands. They were scarred with small angry chemical burns, the telltale marks of someone who worked in the match factories, and he remembered why he had become a doctor in the first place. He carried her to the back room, laying her on the same cot where his wife had breathed her last. As he worked to revive her with a dash of sal volatile, Clara began to pour out her story, a tale of misery and manipulation that made Silas's blood run cold. She spoke of her younger brother, Pip, a boy of only 12 who was slowly rotting away from phossy jaw, the horrific industrial disease contracted from the white phosphorus at the match factory owned by the Cavendish family. The Duchess, known to the public as a paragon of charity, had personally denied Pip's pension. She had looked at the boy's agonizing facial decay and called it a result of poor hygiene, a lack of moral character, rather than the toxic environment of her own profitable enterprise. Clara had been desperate. She had watched her brother's jawbone turn green and porous, watched him waste away while she served the very woman responsible for his ruin. It was in this moment of weakness that Lord Julian had found her. Julian, the Duke's younger brother, was a man whose charm was as thin as a coat of paint, hiding a soul hollowed out by gambling debts and resentment. He had approached Clara in the shadows of the Althorpe Gardens, speaking in a voice like velvet. He told her he wanted to help. He gave her a small pouch of what he called miraculous pearl powder, a rare substance from the Orient that would restore the Duchess's fading youth. He told Clara that if she mixed it into the Duchess's night cream, the woman would be so overjoyed by her restored beauty that she would grant Clara any favor, including the money for Pip's surgery. Clara had believed him. She had wanted to believe him. She had mixed the powder into the silver jar, thinking she was bringing healing, not realizing she was delivering a lethal dose of arsenic. But as Silas listened, his brow furrowed. He had seen arsenic poisoning before. It was a slow, agonizing death of the internal organs, but it didn't typically cause the skin to peel away in the violent, necrotic fashion Clara described. There was something else at work, a chemical reaction that suggested a deeper, even more sinister secret. As the night deepened, Silas looked at the silver lancet on his table. He realized that this wasn't just about a maid and a poisoned duchess. It was about the very fabric of London society, the way the beautiful and the powerful built their lives on the broken bodies of the poor. He looked at Clara, who had fallen into a fitful sleep, and he knew that he couldn't let her face the gallows alone. But the clock was ticking. In the mansions of Mayfair, the doctors would be arriving, and the Duke would be looking for a scapegoat. Lord Julian would already be weaving his lies, preparing to point the finger at the treacherous maid, and perhaps even the disgraced doctor who had dared to help her. Silas Thorne, a man who had given up on justice, felt a cold, familiar fire beginning to burn in his chest. He had to know the truth. He had to know why the Duchess's skin had reacted so violently. He stepped to his window, looking out at the gas lamps flickering in the fog. He knew that by morning he would be a wanted man. He knew that the silver lancet, once a tool of healing, might soon become his only weapon in a world that wanted him silenced. The rot he had fled years ago had finally caught up to him, and this time he wouldn't turn away. The Duchess's face was peeling, but beneath that mask of beauty lay a truth that could burn the entire Cavendish estate to the ground. And Silas Thorne was the only one left who knew how to find it. The morning light in London does not wake the city. It merely reveals the filth that the night tried to hide. As the first pale rays of October sun struggled to pierce the yellow fog over the Thames, Silas Thorne stood by the window of his cramped apothecary shop, watching the shadows stretch like skeletal fingers across the cobblestones. He could hear the distant, rhythmic clatter of a carriage, but it wasn't the steady pace of a merchant. It was the frantic, urgent beat of the Metropolitan Police. He knew they were coming. He could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, pressing against the glass. Behind him, on the narrow cot, Clara stirred in her sleep, her breath catching in a sob that she couldn't release even in unconsciousness. But the police were not the only ones hunting them. By noon, the newsboys were already at the corners of Smithfield, their voices cracking as they screamed the headlines. "Mad apothecary poisons Duchess, and treacherous maid on the run." Lord Julian had moved faster than Silas anticipated. He hadn't just reported a crime, he had crafted a narrative. He had painted Silas as a disgraced man seeking vengeance against the aristocracy that had cast him out, and Clara as his dim-witted accomplice. The trap was closing, and the walls of the small shop felt like they were shrinking, threatening to crush them both before the truth could ever draw breath. Silas grabbed his worn leather medical bag, his fingers brushing against the tarnished silver lancet. It was cold, a reminder of the sharp, cutting reality of his situation. He woke Clara with a gentle hand on her shoulder. Her eyes snapped open, filled with a terror so deep it looked like glass. "We have to move," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves. Now, they didn't take the main roads, they moved through the labyrinthine alleys of the East End, where the soot was so thick it coated their lungs, and the stench of the river acted as a shroud. They were heading toward the docks, a place where the law rarely ventured and where the secrets of the city went to drown. They found refuge in a derelict warehouse near the Isle of Dogs, a skeletal structure of rotting timber and rusted iron. The air inside was heavy with the smell of sulphur and raw chemicals, the very substances that were fueling the industrial heart of London while poisoning its veins. As Silas set down his bag, he looked at Clara. She was huddled on a crate, her hands still stained with the residue of the Duchess's cream. She looked like a broken doll, her spirit fractured by a guilt she didn't deserve to carry. "Why did he do it, Doctor?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Lord Julian, he seemed so kind. He said the powder would make her happy. He said it would save Pip." Silas looked away, his jaw tight. He knew men like Julian. They didn't see people, they saw chess pieces. To Julian, Clara was just a means to an end, a disposable delivery system for a lethal dose of arsenic. But, as Silas began to unpack his few remaining chemical reagents, a thought began to gnaw at the back of his mind. He had seen the Duchess's face in his mind's eye 1,000 times since Clara described it. The grey ribbons of skin, the translucent necrotic peeling. Arsenic was a silent killer. It attacked the heart, the stomach, the nerves. It didn't turn a face into a melting mask of wax in a matter of minutes. There was something missing from the equation. He pulled out the silver jar Clara had snatched from the vanity in her flight, the tainted cold cream. He also pulled out a small blue glass bottle he had taken from his own shelf before they fled. It contained a concentrated solution used to detect the presence of lead. He sat there, in the dim light of a single tallow candle, performing a silent alchemy. He thought about his wife, Sarah. He remembered the way her skin had paled as the fever took her, the way he had felt utterly powerless despite all his medical knowledge. He had failed her because he had no influence, no money, no voice. And now, looking at Clara, he felt that same suffocating shadow returning. But this time he had the evidence, he had the science, and he realized that if he could prove what really happened to the Duchess, he wouldn't just be saving Clara. He would be redeeming the man he used to be. He carefully mixed a sample of the Duchess's cream with his testing solution. He expected a reaction, but what happened next made his heart skip a beat. The mixture didn't just change color, it hissed and turned a violent, murky black. Silas leaned in, his eyes narrowed. Lead. High concentrations of it. But where had it come from? Clara hadn't mentioned adding anything but the pearl powder Julian had given her. And then it clicked. A memory from his days in the elite circles of London. The Duchess was famous for her porcelain complexion, a whiteness that seemed almost supernatural in the smog of the city. She was using Laird's bloom, Silas muttered, more to himself than to Clara. The girl looked up, confused. Laird's bloom. The Duchess's secret, Silas explained. It's an illegal, lead-heavy cosmetic. The ladies of the court use it to hide the marks of age and the toll of their late-night parties. It's a poison in its own right, but used slowly. It just sits in the pores, building up a layer of toxic metal. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The arsenic Julian had given Clara wasn't meant to kill the Duchess quickly. It was meant to be a slow poison. But Julian hadn't accounted for the Duchess's own vanity. When the arsenic in the cream met the lead already embedded in the Duchess's skin, a catastrophic chemical reaction occurred. The two poisons had fought each other, creating a necrotic fire that literally dissolved the flesh from the bone. The Duchess wasn't just a victim of Julian's greed, she was a victim of her own obsession with a purity that didn't exist. But that was only the beginning. Silas knew that the truth was a double-edged sword. To expose Julian, he would have to expose the Duchess's own illegal habits. He would have to challenge the entire social order of Mayfair, and Lord Julian was already moving to silence him. Outside the warehouse, the sound of heavy boots echoed on the wooden pier. A whistle blew, the sharp, piercing signal of the river police. They had been found. Silas grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her toward a back exit that led to the dark, churning waters of the Thames. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice urgent. "Julian knows I'm close. He knows that if I can analyze that cream, I can prove he provided the arsenic. But more importantly, I can prove the Duchess was already rotting from the inside out." They scrambled onto a small, flat-bottomed coal barge, hiding beneath a greasy tarp as the police lanterns swept over the warehouse they had just vacated. Clara was trembling so hard, the barge seemed to vibrate with her fear. "What if they catch us, Doctor? What will happen to Pip?" Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, hands that were once meant to heal, now covered in the soot of a city that wanted him dead. He thought about the Duchess, lying in her silk-draped bed, her beauty destroyed by the very thing she thought would preserve it. He thought about Pip, his jawbone dissolving because of the greed of the Cavendish family. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The aristocracy was poisoning itself with vanity, while it poisoned the poor with industry. It was a cycle of decay that went deeper than any medicine could reach. "We have to get to the inquest," Silas said, his voice firming with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. "Julian is going to testify tomorrow. He's going to use the Duchess's disfigurement as proof of our malice. He's going to hang you, Clara, and he's going to bury me, unless we show them what's really under that silk." "But how?" Clara asked, her eyes searching his. "The police are everywhere. Every newspaper says you're a madman. No one will listen to a disgraced apothecary and a servant girl." Silas reached into his bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger he had kept from his days as a high-society doctor. It contained the secret accounts of the city's most prestigious chemists, the men who discreetly supplied the elite with their toxic beauty aids. "I still have friends in low places who know the secrets of the high," Silas said, "and I have the science. Julian thinks he's playing a game of reputation, but I'm going to play a game of truth." As the barge drifted further into the fog, Silas realized that the turning point had arrived. He was no longer just running, he was hunting. He was going to walk into the heart of the Althorpe estate, into the lion's den of the London elite, and he was going to strip away the mask of the entire Cavendish family. But he knew the cost would be high. Julian wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect his inheritance. And the Duchess, even in her agony, might prefer a lie that kept her pure over a truth that showed her as a scarred, lead-poisoned woman. The tension in the air was palpable, a thick, suffocating weight that seemed to herald a coming storm. Silas Thorne, the man who had lost everything to his integrity, was about to bet his life on it one last time. He looked at the silver lancet, now glowing faintly in the moonlight. It was no longer just a reminder of his failure. It was a promise that the truth, no matter how much it burned, would finally be told. But as the barge disappeared into the black mouth of a bridge, a dark figure watched from the shadows of the pier. Lord Julian's reach was long, and his desperation was turning into a cold, calculated rage. The game was far from over, and the next move would be written in blood. The great hall of Althorpe House was a cathedral of judgment, its high ceilings lost in the shadows, and its air thick with the suffocating scent of carbolic acid and heavy lilies. It was a room designed to make the small feel insignificant and the guilty feel condemned. On this grim morning, the cream of London society had gathered, not for a ball, but for an inquest, a public flaying of a young maid and a disgraced doctor. Lord Julian stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his black frock coat impeccable, his expression one of practiced aristocratic grief. He looked like a man who had already won, his eyes scanning the room with a cold, predatory satisfaction. But the silence was shattered by the heavy thud of the oak doors swinging open. The light from the foggy street spilled into the hall, and standing in the threshold was Dr. Silas Thorne. He was covered in the soot of the docks, his coat frayed and his eyes bloodshot, but he carried himself with a dignity that silenced the whispers of the room. Beside him, trembling but upright, was Clara. She clutched a small bundle of papers to her chest as if they were a shield. "How dare you?" Lord Julian's voice rang out sharp as a whip. "You are a wanted man, Thorne. To set foot in this house is an admission of your guilt. Constables, seize them! Wait!" Silas's voice was a low roar that stopped the approaching officers in their tracks. He didn't look at the police. He looked directly at the Duke of Althorp, who sat at the centre of the table, his face a mask of sorrow and confusion. "I am here to provide the medical testimony this inquest is missing. I am here to show you exactly what happened to the Duchess." Lord Julian let out a short, mocking laugh. "We know what happened. The girl poisoned her mistress. The cream was laced with arsenic. It's a simple case of betrayal." "Is it?" Silas stepped forward, reaching into his bag and pulling out the silver jar of cold cream. He placed it on the table with a resonant click. "Arsenic is indeed present in this jar, Julian. But arsenic alone did not cause the Duchess's skin to slide from her face like melting wax. Arsenic kills from the inside, slowly. What happened in that bedchamber was a chemical execution, a violent reaction that only occurs when two specific toxins meet." The room went deathly still. Behind a heavy lace veil in the corner, a figure stirred. It was the Duchess, her presence a haunting reminder of the tragedy. She didn't speak, but her hands, gloved in white silk to hide the raw flesh, gripped the arms of her chair. Silas pulled out a second object, a small, leather-bound ledger. "This is the sales record of Mr. Henderson, a chemist in the West End who specializes in discreet beauty aids. According to these entries, the Duchess has been a regular purchaser of Laird's Bloom for over 7 years. For those of you who don't know, Laird's Bloom is a cosmetic so heavy with lead that it is banned in most of Europe. It doesn't just sit on the skin, it embeds itself in the pores, turning the living tissue into a reservoir of toxic metal." Lord Julian's face paled, the smugness beginning to crack. "That is a lie. My sister-in-law would never—" "Silence!" the Duke barked, his eyes fixed on Silas. "Continue, Doctor." Silas opened his medical kit and pulled out his tarnished silver lancet. He dipped the tip of the blade into the silver jar of cream and then held it over a small glass dish he had prepared. When the arsenic Julian gave to Clara was mixed into this cream, it was meant to be a slow, untraceable poison. Julian wanted the Duchess to waste away over months so he could inherit the estate without suspicion. But he didn't know about the lead. When the arsenic met the lead already in her skin, it created a volatile salt, a substance so caustic it literally burned the flesh off her face in a matter of minutes. Silas turned his gaze toward Lord Julian, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "You didn't just try to kill her, Julian. You used a girl's desperation for her dying brother to do your dirty work. You gave her that pearl powder, knowing it was poison. But your greed was blind to her vanity, and the result is the horror you see before you." But he wasn't done yet. This was the moment of no return. Silas reached into Clara's bundle of papers and pulled out a single, crumpled telegram. And here is the final proof. A telegram from Lord Julian to a gambling den in Paris, promising payment of his debts by the end of the month, the exact date he expected the Duchess to be declared incapacitated. The hall erupted in a chaos of gasps and shouted accusations. Lord Julian lunged for the papers, his face twisted into a mask of rage, but the constables were faster. They tackled him to the floor, the man who had thought himself untouchable, now reduced to a snarling animal in the dirt. As he was dragged away, his screams for mercy were drowned out by the judgmental silence of his peers. The reputation he had tried to protect was gone, replaced by a scandal that would haunt the Cavendish name for generations. The Duke stood up, his gaze falling on Clara. The girl was shaking, her eyes fixed on the floor. He looked at Silas, and for a moment the two men, the aristocrat and the outcast, locked eyes. There was no apology, no grand gesture. The Duke simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that had been unearthed. But the true resolution came days later, far from the marble halls of Mayfair. Silas used the reward money, an out-of-court settlement he had demanded from the Duke in exchange for keeping the lead makeup scandal out of the morning tabloids, to fulfill a promise. He didn't return to the medical elite. He didn't seek his old life back. Instead, he rented a small, clean building in the heart of Smithfield, right on the edge of the industrial district. He opened a clinic, a place where the air didn't smell of lilies or carbolic acid, but of honest medicine and hope. In the back room, Pip, Clara's brother, sat in a comfortable chair, his jaw bandaged and his eyes bright with a life that had nearly been extinguished. The surgery had been successful, paid for by the very family that had caused his injury. Clara stood by the window, her hands no longer trembling. She was no longer a maid. She was Silas's apprentice, learning the art of healing from a man who had finally healed himself. She watched the sunset over the London rooftops, the fog turning a deep, warm amber. "Doctor," she said, turning toward him, "do you think people will ever stop caring so much about how they look on the outside?" Silas looked at the silver lancet, now polished and bright, resting on a clean white cloth. He thought of the Duchess, who survived her ordeal but would forever bear the scars of her own vanity, a living reminder that the masks we wear can eventually consume us. "Perhaps not," Silas replied softly. "But as long as there is a mask, there will be a need for the truth. Because in a world that wants everything to be white and pure, the only thing that doesn't peel away is the strength of a person's soul." The story of the maid and the doctor became a legend in the dark corners of the city, a reminder that even in the heart of the Victorian fog, justice can find a way. Silas Thorne had found his calling again, not as a star of the elite, but as a guardian of the broken. And as the gas lamp flickered in the window of the clinic, casting a warm glow over the cobblestones, the silver lancet remained, a symbol that the doctor had finally returned to his true purpose. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join our community. Your support allows us to keep bringing these powerful narratives to life. Leave a comment below with a rating from 0 to 10. Did the ending satisfy you? What would you have done in Clara's place? Thank you for walking through the shadows of history with us. We'll be waiting for you in our next story, right here, where the past is never truly forgotten.